In the quiet town, there was something that had everyone talking. It was the dog Shadow. The large black dog was always at the same spot, sitting next to a grave in the cemetery at the edge of town. Every day, without fail, Shadow sat by the grave, never straying, even when the weather was harsh. It was strange. The townspeople whispered among themselves, wondering what kept the dog loyal to the spot. He didn't bark or run, and did not seem to need anything but the grave. His eyes, dark and full of mystery, stared at the headstone with an intensity that made everyone who passed stop and wonder. Who was buried there? And why was this dog so devoted to the grave? Sarah, a local journalist, first heard about the dog from an old woman at the grocery store. That dog, the woman said, shaking her head, has been there for weeks. Won't leave. He just sits, watching. Sarah was intrigued. She had heard whispers about the dog before, but something about the way the woman spoke piqued her curiosity. It wasn't just the dog's behavior that was odd. It was the way people spoke of him, as though there was something more going on, something no one could explain. Sarah's instincts as a reporter kicked in. She decided she needed to learn more. Who was this dog? And why was he so devoted to a grave with no visitors? Sarah began asking around. The first person she spoke to was a man who worked at the local diner. He's been coming to that grave every day, he said, eyeing Sarah with interest. He never moves, not even when it rains. It's like he's waiting for something. Sarah pressed him for more details. Do you know who the grave belongs to? The man paused for a moment, thinking. I think it's some guy named Marcus. Real quiet and never bothered anyone. He moved here not long ago. But that dog's got a connection to him, that's for sure. Sarah continued asking around, and she learned more about Marcus. The man had come to town just a year ago, a stranger to everyone, but never someone to stand out. He was kind, one woman explained, but distant, always polite but never opened up much. No one knew much about Marcus's past, but they all agreed on one thing. He had a good heart. Quiet and reserved, he seemed to keep to himself, avoiding the town's social circles. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, something he hadn't shared with anyone. As Sarah spoke to more people, bits and pieces of Marcus's past began to surface. There were rumors that he had been running from something, perhaps a past he didn't want to face. One man mentioned that Marcus had never talked about why he moved to the town. He seemed burdened, like he was carrying something heavy, the man said. Sarah listened carefully, sensing there was more to Marcus's story than the locals were willing to reveal. It wasn't just his quiet nature. It was as if something dark had followed him here, something that he couldn't escape. The more Sarah investigated, the more she found herself drawn to the dog. Shadow's devotion was no accident. It was clear that this dog and Marcus had shared a deep connection. The way Shadow stayed by the grave, his eyes never leaving the headstone, made Sarah feel there was a bond between them that transcended simple companionship. Why had Shadow chosen to stay by Marcus's grave? What had Marcus meant to him? Sarah couldn't help but feel that the dog was waiting for something. Perhaps for the answers to questions Marcus had never shared with anyone. She was certain now that there was a deeper story hidden beneath the surface, a mystery that needed to be solved. Shadow was more than a dog, he was family. For years, he had been by Jack's side, through thick and thin, sharing a life that was full of quiet moments and deep understanding. Jack wasn't the type to open up to people, but with Shadow he didn't need to say much. The bond they shared was unspoken, but it was as real as any relationship could be. Wherever Jack went, Shadow followed. They were inseparable. When Jack would sit on his porch, gazing out over the hills, Shadow would lie at his feet, his head resting on Jack's lap, content just to be near him. It was a bond built on trust and loyalty, a connection that seemed to go beyond simple companionship. Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was Jack's constant, his unwavering companion through a life that, while simple, was never lonely because of the dog by his side. Jack lived alone, far from the hustle and bustle of town. His house sat at the edge of a forest, isolated from the world around him. It wasn't that Jack didn't want to be part of the community, he simply didn't know how. There was a quiet pain in his eyes that kept people at a distance. He had always been like that, even as a child. He preferred the company of Shadow, who never judged him or asked for anything but his presence. People in town would occasionally see Jack walking into the store, his head down, avoiding eye contact. He never lingered, never stayed to chat. He didn't need to. At home, he had Shadow. That was enough. Even in his isolation, Jack's heart was never empty. The bond he had with his dog was enough to fill the silence of his life. And yet, it was clear that Jack was running from something he couldn't shake off. He'd never talk about it, but sometimes, when he sat in his rocking chair at night, staring out at the darkness, Shadow would nudge him, as though sensing the weight Jack carried. Years passed, and eventually Jack grew older and slower. Shadow stayed by his side, ever faithful, watching over him. But time had a way of catching up with Jack, and one winter he fell ill. It wasn't a sudden thing, it was a slow decline, the kind that leaves you watching someone fade away bit by bit. When Jack passed away, it was the end of an era for both him and Shadow. The dog was devastated. He stayed by Jack's side, even after the house was emptied and the funeral had come and gone. Shadow was alone, but his loyalty never wavered. He stayed in the house, waiting for Jack to come back, not understanding that his owner was gone forever. For months, Shadow roamed the house and the land, a silent guardian over a world that had lost its anchor. It wasn't until the house was sold and the new owners moved in that Shadow finally left. But he didn't go far. He had heard something about Marcus, heard that the new man in town was different, quieter. Shadow, with his keen senses, had known he needed to follow. One day, as Sarah was visiting Marcus's grave, something caught her eye. It was a small, old photograph that had been tucked under a weathered stone at the foot of the grave. She knelt down and carefully lifted it, her fingers brushing over the faded edges. In the photo, there was Jack. She recognized him instantly. He was standing with a young boy around 10 or 11 years old. The boy had a sad smile, one that reminded Sarah of the kind of sadness people wear when they've known loss. She stared at the photograph for a long time, her heart racing with questions. Who was the boy? Why had this picture been left here, so close to Marcus's grave? She felt a shiver run down her spine as a thought crossed her mind. Could Marcus have been the boy in the photograph? Was he somehow connected to Jack and Shadow? The photograph was the key. Sarah's heart beat faster as she pieced together what she knew so far. She thought of Shadow, his devotion to the grave, his loyalty that seemed to have no end. It wasn't just that he missed his previous owner. It was that he was searching for something, or someone. She couldn't stop herself. She had to find out more about Marcus, about his life and what had happened to him. Was he the boy in the photograph? Had he known Jack? Was there a connection between them? Something that could explain Shadow's strange devotion to Marcus's grave? As Sarah walked away from the graveyard, the weight of the mystery grew heavier. She knew she was getting closer, but the truth, whatever it was, seemed to slip just beyond her reach. The more she uncovered, the more questions she had. She was on the trail now, and she wasn't going to stop until she had the answers. Shadow's past was waiting to be uncovered, and Sarah was determined to find out what it was. As Sarah dug deeper into Marcus's past, the story of his strained relationship with his father, Jack, began to unfold. It wasn't a simple family misunderstanding. It was years of silence, broken promises, and unresolved anger. The more Sarah learned, the clearer it became that Marcus and Jack had been estranged for most of Marcus's adult life. Residents had heard bits and pieces over the years. Whispers about a son who had grown distant from his father, a father who had withdrawn into his world, seemingly too proud or too hurt to reach out. But no one seemed to know the full story. Sarah was determined to understand it. What had caused the rift? Why had Marcus walked away from Jack all those years ago? It was clear now, this was a wound that hadn't healed. The kind of wound that left scars deeper than anyone knew. And though Marcus had tried to live his life, that hurt had followed him, like an invisible weight he could never shake off. Sarah felt the weight of the regret in the words people shared about Marcus. There was a quiet sorrow in their voices when they spoke of him. He had often carried the burden of his past on his shoulders, and the deep guilt over not reconciling with his father haunted him. Marcus would sometimes talk about Jack. One local woman, Mrs. Henson, said softly, her hands folding in front of her. He'd always say how much he wished he could have made things right before it was too late. He regretted it, you could see it in his eyes. But, she hesitated, clearly uncomfortable talking about it. But he couldn't bring himself to reach out. Sarah's heart sank as she processed this. Marcus hadn't been able to forgive himself for the distance between him and Jack, even though it seemed like both men had been trapped in their pride. That regret, that longing for reconciliation, was something Sarah had seen many times before, when a person realizes too late that the time for forgiveness has passed. It was only recently that Marcus had learned that Jack had passed away. The news hit him hard, and it was the catalyst that brought him back to town. He hadn't come back to reconnect with the town or to rekindle old friendships. He had come to make peace with the ghost of his father. The few conversations Sarah managed to have with people who knew Marcus suggested that he had returned not just to mourn Jack, but to find a sense of closure, to finally come to terms with his father's death. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about letting go of the past and finding peace within himself. But there was still so much left unsaid, and Sarah could feel the weight of that unfinished story hanging in the air. Sarah couldn't help but wonder, had Marcus found the closure he was looking for? Or had his return been too late, as so many things in life often are? Through her interviews, Sarah learned that there had been one unexpected link between Marcus and his father Shadow, the dog. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He had been a constant in Marcus's life when he returned to town, and the locals seemed to think that Shadow had played a pivotal role in connecting Marcus to Jack's memory. It was almost as if the dog knew what Marcus needed, offering him silent companionship and understanding. In the days before Marcus's death, he had been seen walking with Shadow by the lake, both of them lost in their thoughts, side by side. Some even said Marcus would sit with Shadow by the grave, as if the dog knew where to be, when to be there. Sarah was struck by how deeply connected Shadow had become to Marcus's journey, almost as if he was the bridge between the past and present, helping Marcus navigate the painful road of reconciliation with himself. Locals recalled moments when Marcus and Shadow seemed to share an unspoken understanding of each other. Their grief, though different, was connected in a way that only those who had lost deeply could understand. It wasn't just that Shadow missed Jack. No, it was more than that. The bond that had formed between Shadow and Marcus was rooted in a shared experience of loss, of a world that had taken from both of them what they had loved most. There were stories of them sitting together, no words spoken, but something passed between them, an unspoken solace. For Marcus, Shadow was the only one who understood the depth of his regret, the pain of never getting to say goodbye to his father. For Shadow, Marcus was the only one who had given him the love and attention Jack once did. In the months leading up to Marcus's death, Shadow seemed to grow more protective of him, following him everywhere, and staying close by his side. It was as if the dog had become not just a companion, but a guardian, watching over the man who had carried so much pain and regret. Just as Marcus seemed to be finding some peace with his past, tragedy struck. His death was sudden, unexpected, and left the town in shock. The unanswered questions lingered in the air, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder what might have been if Marcus had had more time. More time to make peace, to heal old wounds. But the questions would remain unanswered. All that was left was Shadow, the dog who had stayed loyal to a man who had never fully healed, just as he had stayed loyal to Jack. Sarah couldn't help but think of how much Shadow had lost, how much he had witnessed. Now it was Shadow who was left behind, clinging to the only piece of the past that still mattered. Sarah knew she would need to learn more. There was still so much to uncover about Marcus, about Jack, and about the dog who had been there through it all. But the grief in the air was thick, and the weight of the story was heavy. For Sarah, it was a reminder of how much loss a heart can carry, how much grief can live in silence, and how sometimes the bonds we share with others, human or not, can hold the power to heal wounds we didn't even know we had. Sarah's investigation into Marcus's life revealed a tale steeped in regret. The estrangement between Marcus and his father, Jack, was not a recent occurrence, but a wound that had festered for years. Sarah uncovered letters, conversations, and old stories that revealed Marcus's guilt over the lost time with his father. Their relationship had been strained, riddled with misunderstandings and harsh words. Over time, the distance between them grew until there was no communication at all. The pain of the estrangement stayed with Marcus, shaping every decision he made. No matter how successful or content he seemed on the outside, inside he was haunted by the silence that stretched between him and Jack. Sarah couldn't help but imagine the weight Marcus carried, the regret of words left unsaid, apologies that never came. He never had the chance to fix what had been broken. The revelation hit Sarah with full force as she realized the extent of Marcus's regret. After Jack's death, Marcus returned to the town, desperate to make amends, but it was too late. Jack was gone, and the opportunity to reconcile had slipped through his fingers. Sarah learned that Marcus had confided in a friend shortly before his death. "I should have gone back sooner," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "But now I can't." Those words echoed in Sarah's mind. Marcus had spent his life trying to come to terms with the loss of his father, but nothing could erase the guilt he carried. His return to the town was an attempt at closure, but it was an attempt doomed to fail. The regret Marcus carried wasn't just about missing the opportunity to speak to Jack. It was the realization that he would never have the chance to fix their broken relationship. It was during this time of deep regret that Marcus met Shadow, a stray dog wandering near the outskirts of town. Shadow was a dog marked by his own history of loss. Abandoned and wandering alone, he seemed as broken as Marcus. But when Marcus took Shadow in, something began to change. For Marcus, Shadow wasn't just a dog. The dog was a living reminder of his father's unconditional love. Shadow became the bridge between Marcus and the memory of Jack, a connection that words couldn't express. With every walk, every quiet moment shared, Marcus felt as if he were reconnecting with Jack through the dog. Shadow was the one living thing that truly understood him, the one who could offer the kind of comfort Marcus had longed for. It was a bond that was unspoken, yet deeply felt. Shadow, without even knowing it, became Marcus's final chance at healing. The dog didn't need to say anything, didn't need to offer advice. His presence was enough. As Sarah pieced together Marcus's final months, she realized how important Shadow had become. It was more than just companionship. Shadow had become a symbol of reconciliation. In the silence that stretched between Marcus and his father, Shadow had found a way to bridge the gap. Sarah came to understand that Marcus hadn't just adopted a dog. He had found a way to make peace with his past. Shadow was the living embodiment of the love Jack had once shown him. When Marcus looked at the dog, he saw not just a pet, but a piece of the father he had lost. Shadow became the bridge Marcus needed to heal, a connection to his father that could never be spoken aloud. For Marcus, the dog was more than just a reminder of what had been lost. Shadow was a companion on a journey of forgiveness, a quiet witness to the emotional weight that Marcus had carried for so long. And in the dog's eyes, Marcus saw the possibility of letting go of the guilt that had consumed him for so many years. In the months leading up to Marcus's death, the townspeople began to notice something change in him. He was quieter, more peaceful. The weight that had burdened him seemed to lift, even if only slightly. It was in the moments spent with Shadow, those small exchanges that spoke volumes without saying a word. Locals remembered seeing Marcus walking with Shadow by his side, both moving at a slower pace, as if they were in tune with each other's grief. It was clear that, in Shadow, Marcus had found something he had been searching for. A silent companion who understood his pain, who didn't ask questions or offer empty words of comfort. It was a kind of healing that wasn't about fixing the past, but about finding a way to live with it. In the quiet of the mornings and the stillness of the nights, Marcus seemed to find a fragile peace, a peace that was found not in forgiveness, but in acceptance. Then, without warning, tragedy struck. Marcus's death was as sudden as it was shocking. The town was left reeling, unsure how to process the loss of someone who had seemed to be on the verge of healing. Sarah, too, was stunned. She had been so close to understanding Marcus's story, to piecing together the puzzle of his life. But now, with his death, everything was left incomplete. The community mourned the loss of Marcus, but for Sarah, the grief was different. It wasn't just the loss of a person. It was the loss of a journey that was unfinished, the loss of a man who had spent so much of his life trying to reconcile with his past, only to have it taken from him. In the wake of Marcus's death, Shadow's grief was unmistakable. The dog wandered through the town, his eyes searching, his steps heavy. He had lost the one person who had truly understood him, just as he had once lost Jack. Sarah couldn't help but see the parallels between Shadow's grief and his loyalty. The dog's devotion to Marcus mirrored the love he had shown Jack all those years ago. Shadow had been there for Jack in the quiet moments of his life, and now he was there for Marcus, offering the same silent comfort. As Shadow lay next to Marcus's grave, Sarah realized that the dog's loyalty had never wavered. Shadow's grief was not just for Marcus but for the love he had given and the love that had been lost. And in that loyalty, Sarah found the true depth of the bond between man and dog, one that transcends time, loss, and even death. After months of searching for answers, Sarah compiled everything she had learned about Marcus's life. She uncovered a story full of regret, loneliness, and a desperate longing for reconciliation with a father he had been estranged from for most of his life. Despite the time apart, Marcus had never stopped thinking about Jack. His guilt for the years without contact weighed on him heavily, and Sarah could sense that even in death, Marcus yearned to make amends. With a heavy heart, Sarah shared Marcus's story with the community. She told them about the pain he had carried, about his return to town to find peace, only to discover that Jack had passed away. Sarah emphasized the silent regret that had driven Marcus's every step. As the words left her lips, The room grew silent, the weight of his journey settling on everyone present. The people understood. They, too, had regrets and lost opportunities. Marcus's story touched something deep inside them, reminding them of the importance of reconciling before it was too late. After hearing Marcus's story, the community came together, moved by the bond between him and Shadow. The dog had been a loyal companion to both Jack and Marcus, and now he represented something much deeper. The love Marcus and Shadow had shared was a love that transcended words. The townspeople saw it and felt it. They rallied around Shadow, not just as a dog, but as a living reminder of the love and loyalty that existed between father, son, and dog. They offered food, care, and a sense of belonging to Shadow. People opened their homes to him, making sure he had a place to rest and feel safe. The town had never felt more connected, each person touched by the grief of a man who had tried to return home but could not. In caring for Shadow, they honored Marcus's memory and the unwavering devotion that had defined his life, and Jack's, too. The town's support for Shadow wasn't just a gesture. It was a commitment. People made sure that Shadow's needs were met. He was given food, a warm bed, and the kind of love that would help him heal. The community had witnessed his grief, and they were determined to help him move forward, just as they would have for any other member of their town. Shadow had been loyal to Marcus, and now the town would be loyal to him. With every act of kindness, the town showed its respect for the bond that had existed between Marcus and Shadow. They ensured that the dog's remaining years would be filled with comfort and companionship, a reflection of the love he had given to Marcus and Jack. As Sarah watched the town come together to care for Shadow, something inside her shifted. She had always felt a sense of connection to the dog, but now, she realized that it wasn't just about offering him food or a place to stay. Shadow needed stability, a home where he could heal in his own time. Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to give him that. After careful thought, she decided to adopt him. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Shadow had suffered, and there would be days when the pain of loss would still haunt him. But Sarah understood the depths of his grief, having learned so much about Marcus's journey. She couldn't imagine abandoning him now. Sarah took Shadow to Marcus's grave regularly, respecting the quiet moments he needed. She allowed him the space to grieve, understanding that healing could not be rushed. Shadow would often sit by the grave, his eyes soft and filled with sorrow. There were no words spoken, just an understanding between the two of them. Sarah didn't force Shadow to leave the site. She sat beside him, offering her presence, but never interfering in his process. Slowly, Shadow began to visit the grave less frequently. His grief wasn't gone, but the dog was slowly finding a way to live with it. Sarah respected his need for closure, allowing him to process at his own pace. Over time, she noticed a shift in him. Shadow had begun to trust again, to find comfort in his new home, and Sarah knew that he was healing in his way. In the end, Shadow's journey became more than just a story of loss. It was a testament to the healing power of love and loyalty. He had been a constant presence in Marcus's life, a bridge between him and Jack. Now, as Sarah looked at the dog resting peacefully in her home, she understood that the love and connection Shadow had shown were a reminder of the bonds that endure even after death. The story of Marcus and Shadow, and the community's support for the dog, left a legacy of healing and compassion. As time passed, Sarah knew that Shadow would carry with him the lessons of love, loyalty, and the strength of connection. As she continued to care for him, she honored Marcus's memory by giving Shadow the love and home he had always deserved. Sarah sat, lost in thought. She reflected on the journey she had taken with Marcus and Shadow, on the deep emotions and painful truths that had come to light. She thought about the themes of loyalty, forgiveness, and love. Marcus's search for peace had been difficult, and Shadow's quiet presence by his grave spoke volumes. It was clear to Sarah now. The bond between Marcus and Shadow went beyond words. It was a love that had endured the harshest of losses. Shadow's loyalty was a silent testament to the depth of the connection he had shared with Marcus. Every day, he sat by Marcus's grave, showing a love that didn't need to be expressed in words. Sarah knew that this bond wasn't just about affection. It was about an understanding that surpassed even death. Shadow's devotion was proof that true loyalty lives in silence, quietly enduring through time. Marcus's journey was one of guilt and redemption, but also hope. His path hadn't been easy, and he never had the chance to fully reconcile with Jack. Yet, through his bond with Shadow, he found some peace. Shadow, too, had experienced his healing, carrying the weight of both men's pain with unwavering love. Their story was a reminder that even in the face of regret, redemption, and love could still bloom. Sarah looked out over the town, where the legacy of Marcus and Shadow's bond was felt deeply. The community had come together, not just to care for Shadow, but to honor the love that had brought them all closer. As Sarah watched Shadow sit by Marcus's grave one last time, she knew that their story had impacted her and the town forever. The love they shared, though untold in words, had shaped everyone it touched.